important to me, and it's now changed. And I've been really thinking about how to honor that. So there was what was an open lot. I grew up in Boston when there were tons of open lots. I don't know how many of you were here during that time where like nobody wanted to be here before everybody wanted to be here. And there was a lot where we used to have peace concerts. And of course I knew, honestly, if I had it's adjacent to a park, so I might have thought to save it as open space, just if I'm being honest, because we could have merged it with the park and made that park bigger. But there is a building there now, and there's a youth program in that building. And one of the things that's been really important to me, it's called Future Chefs, and so they're training young people around culinary arts. And whenever I go there, a good friend of mine has her birthday party there every year, and we cook food together. But one of the things I've made a commitment to is to make sure that every time I see young people in that space, I tell them that that is a place where young people gather during a very tough time in our city's history. And that it's really important for them to remember that for me, that ground is really sacred because it was a place that we reflected our hopes, that our city would be a more peaceful place and a safer place. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the organization Gang Peace. The founder of it unfortunately passed a couple of years ago. But anyway, it was a place that was really important to me for that reason. And I lift that up because when I came into this position, I met with a lot of our team and came to really understand it. I come from one of the neighborhoods and grew up with a lot less context for what historic preservation is about. It was something that growing up I saw as a downtown thing. And I think everyone in this room knows that it's so much bigger than just downtown. Obviously, we have to preserve the history of downtown. How many people were on the Freedom Trail when they used to let you into houses to see the old like underground hatch? Okay, so there's a few of us who are around for that time. Obviously, I know that they can't do that anymore with millions of people doing that chore. But there are so many important stories and places in our city, and I've been thankful many of you have raised the need to expand that story and to make sure that historic preservation feels like something that the entire city is connected to. I remember when I was in the 7th grade, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and he mentioned that the first place that he lived when he moved to Boston was on Wambach Street, the street I grew up on. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, we need a plaque on the street. And I didn't really know what the process was but I am going to make sure that I get it together in one of these days, actually get that plaque up there. But the reality is that this is a city full of stories. And not just since our colonial past. This is a land full of stories for thousands of years. And I think one of the most exciting things is that in a couple of years, we'll be celebrating not just the anniversary of the country, but by 2030, we'll be celebrating the anniversary of the city. And it has been an amazing privilege to ask the question, what is the story we want to tell about who we are as a city? And how do we make that story as wide and as rich as we possibly can? There are so many untold stories. Some of them absolutely beautiful, and some of them challenging. And the important part of history is not just to tell the beautiful stories, we're definitely going to do those, but also to spend some time helping ourselves to face those places that are challenging and ask ourselves, what do we want to learn from this? And who do we want to be in response to this? And so you'll be hearing from Murray Miller in a moment to talk about how this all becomes real and how we're trying to lean into this. And there's lots of things to talk about. I mean, as some of you, we were just talking about how do we do the Article 80 part? Like, how do we think about a lot of things and that are tangible in the ways that we do it? But I really wanted to share my own story because my excitement really comes from being in the city that I love, having grown up here my whole life. And honestly, at some times in my life, only knowing certain parts of the city and not others. But at this point in my life, being able to learn and see the richness of the city as a whole, and knowing that we have not just a responsibility to tell that full story, but there is an opportunity to find new levels of wonder, for us to grow, for us to reflect, and for us really as a city to be the kind of place that sets an example, quite frankly, I think for the region and for the country, about how we tell the full story of who we are and use that as an opportunity to decide who we want to be going forward. So I thank you for being in this space. I thank you for your commitment to historic preservation. I hope you are as excited as I am about the opportunities that are before us to widen our picture, to go deeper, and to engage people more, to not just save spaces, but to animate them, to make sure that everybody has access to them, to make sure that people know what happened here. I will say I've learned about buildings that we've saved, and I was like, what? I didn't even know that was here. So the other piece of this is making sure that we don't just preserve the history, but we make sure that we promote it in such a way that people know what they're walking past, what they're seeing, what happened there, and what it can teach us about who we are and who we want to be. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our Director of Historic Preservation, but I think Nick is coming in the in-between to do the introduction. Thank you.
Lights, weren't you? Good evening again. We may have to do that one again. Now, I'm very pleased that you all came out tonight. Thank you, Chief White-Hammond, for that very thought-provoking intro, and it caused me to think about some of the things that we're going to share this evening, and to really think about historic preservation in ways that we may not have previously. This vision acknowledges and draws upon the significant preservation work that has been achieved in Boston. It reflects upon the current preservation landscape, including the challenges we face. And importantly, it seeks to embrace an incredible opportunity to chart a path forward, one that positions historic preservation to proactively demonstrate and encourage environmental stewardship, one that is responsive, relevant, and in alignment with contemporary values, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In this slide, you might note that our most noteworthy challenges are our greatest opportunities. This vision identifies issues and challenges, opportunities and ideas, strategic priorities, and potential next steps. It's a special honor to kick off the first District Commission presentation of the vision with commissioners of the first locally designated historic district in Massachusetts, the historic Beacon Hill District. In the Book of Boston, the last chapter is titled A Suggested Tour of Federal Boston. It includes a list of historic sites concentrated on Beacon Hill. And long before its designation, and following the siege of Boston, we can acknowledge that Beacon Hill was transformed into an enclave for wealthy and powerful Bostonians, and it continues to serve as the seat of political power in the Commonwealth. We know that the southern slope of Beacon Hill was developed with lavish homes for Boston's elite. And we know that the north and western slopes served as home of a working middle class community, including many free African Americans. This area became a hotbed of abolitionist and Underground Railroad activity in the years leading up to the Civil War. Centered on the north slope of Beacon Hill, the African American community of 1800s Boston led the city and the nation in the fight against slavery and injustice. These remarkable men and women, together with their allies, were leaders in the abolition movement, the Underground Railroad, the Civil War, and the early struggle for equal rights and education. Today, Beacon Hill Historic District is considered to be one of the finest and least altered examples of a large federal period urban area in the United States. It is also nationally recognized for its remarkable and often overlooked history, a potential opportunity that the Commemoration Commission was recently established might consider. As we continue to build upon the information shared from last summer's Slavery in Boston exhibit, we could ask, what might we discover about the members of the Black community that settled in Beacon Hill in the early 19th century and their continued courageous resistance to injustice, segregation, and slavery? Might we consider other forms of movement and pose the question, what stops on the Underground Railroad might be investigated further, and how might these layers of history be elevated and told? In exploring these questions, events, places, and people, like George Middleton, an African American who built the oldest house standing on Beacon Hill, may be revealed. And these are matters likely to be of direct interest to the community. We know about the Lewis and Harriet Hayden House at 66 Phillips Street, whose owners had escaped slavery in the 1850s in Kentucky before settling on the north slope of Beacon Hill and establishing the most active Underground Railroad safe house in the city. This photograph from around 1909 shows part of the shield for the construction of a tunnel under Beacon Hill. We know that 5 Pinckney Street is the oldest house on Beacon Hill, and it was owned by Lewis Glapian and George Middleton, who were among the first African Americans to settle on Beacon Hill's north slope. As we seek to uplift underserved communities, might further investigation reveal that there is a story to be told about this property and an association with the LGBTQ+ history? We know about others documented as part of the historic homes on the Black Heritage Trail. These are known places associated with helping runaway slaves evade the law on both the north and south sides of the hill. But how do we know which places were stops along the Underground Railroad when this was a very secretive operation? What type of information remains unknown or unwoven into the story of Boston? Might an investment of time and resources be beneficial so that additional layers of information could be uncovered and so that a more complete story of Boston might be told? In Dorchester, the Shirley Eustace House was known among nearby residents to be associated with enslaved people. It was the oral history that kept the story alive, and subsequently confirmed by research and archaeological investigation. Imagine how many similar places might be discovered or lost due to an information gap. In Charlestown, our archaeological program is setting out to narrow the information gap through a community-led dig that would have the community ask questions about new information that may be uncovered. The vision for historic preservation in Boston recognizes the challenges and opportunities presented when there are information gaps that impact our ability to tell the full story. The vision includes a strategic focus that prompts us to ask, how might we contribute to the national focus of uplifting underserved communities? Like, how might we celebrate the contributions of the Haitian community in revitalizing Codman Square in Dorchester? Or the Vietnamese community's efforts to save Fields Corner after the Vietnam War in 1975? How might we recognize the legacy left by the Jewish community along Blue Hill Avenue corridor? Might it be beneficial to invest time and resources into understanding how the layers of Boston's history might be told in relation to the effects of displacement on immigrant communities? Marshaling investment and attention to honor a history that includes all Bostonians, not only that of certain communities, is a key aspect of the vision. For example, until the end of World War II, the New York Streets neighborhood was a vibrant, multi-ethnic neighborhood of tenement houses, mom and pop shops, but it fell to make way for Boston's first urban renewal project. The city took control in 1955, and by 1957, 321 buildings had been demolished and 1,000 residents displaced from their home and community. Who were the residents that lived there? What might we learn from such events that erased Scollay Square? Scollay Square was a vibrant community in downtown Boston named for William Scollay, a prominent local developer and militia officer. It was another Boston neighborhood that was removed through urban renewal. The reasons for clearing Scollay Square were based on its physical appearance and social fabric. By directing early urban renewal efforts to that area, the resulting loss of 1,500 structures was considered a terrible blow to the historic fabric of Boston's downtown and would permanently alter the daily human experience of the neighborhood. We know that Scollay Square was the entertainment district of Boston up until it was demolished in the 1960s to create City Hall. This area was home to several LGBTQ plus bars, which were often raided by the police to terrorize the community. Perhaps it is important that we invest time and resources to contribute to the development of a commensurate commemoration to parts of Boston that were previously erased. And one might ask, what would commensurate commemoration look like? Might it inform future development? And where practical, might it be worth exploring ways to stitch back the historic fabric of the community in a way that would be of interest to the community as well as tourists? And might that also be a source that contributes to the local economy? So many cities have a traumatic story to tell about their most vulnerable people being removed, and it's not just in recent history. In 1676, colonists removed the Massachusetts tribe to concentration camps on Deer and Long Islands. It is anticipated that there are several areas of unmarked burials on these islands, but their exact locations are unknown. Is this an area we might work in partnership with the Massachusetts tribe and others to invest time and resources to locate and record unmarked burials? Might there be other areas that should be investigated? These are questions representing an important investigative and research matters that relate to the vision's efforts to tell a more complete story and to uplift underserved communities. This will require time and resources. In relation to time and resources, I'm reminded that there are other types of opportunities that arise from a strength and a challenge that relates to a key aspect of the Commemoration Commission. For most of the last half century, it has been a standard practice across the nation to devote nearly 100% of time and resources within historic preservation programs to processing applications and designating important places. And we can acknowledge that such a focus has produced outcomes that reflect a particular strength and a host of challenges. In 1955, when Beacon Hill was designated a local historic district, the tools that were developed to protect the significance of the place were designed to achieve a certain outcome. And it was very effective, given the emphasis and priorities of the day. To be sure, preservationists are to be commended for their efforts in seeking to protect places of great historic importance that teach us about a certain aspect of our past. A heightened interest in a resource-intensive approach to inform architectural preservation and restoration activities was evident in the 1955 legislation that set it to protect Beacon Hill, and it remains evident in the practice of historic preservation that has influenced a deliberate focus in how historic preservation has been practiced for almost 70 years. Examining our mechanisms, policies, and procedures so that we make the best use of this opportunity to revitalize and revolutionize our approach is the underpinnings of this vision. If we consider the great opportunities and challenges that contribute to the baseline conditions of the Office of Historic Preservation, you will see that it is made up of 3 divisions: the Archaeological Program, the Boston Landmarks Commission, and the Commemoration Commission. There are a total of 11 commissions that may utilize up to 94 volunteers who are drawn from a limited pool. The number of volunteers increases with each district designation as a result of the enabling legislation that governs how historic preservation is practiced. In relation to the Landmark Commission, where the vision seeks to uplift underserved communities and mitigate adverse effects of climate change through historic preservation, it is worth noting that the Commission has previously outlined their priorities to replace the demolition delay regulations known as Article 85, revise the enabling legislation, and update historic resource surveys. This represents 3 considerable challenges, and I would say 3 significant opportunities. In relation to staff time, the area outlined in red indicates that at least 60% of the office resources is allocated to landmark and district commissions. And at least 62% of this resource allocation is allocated primarily to design review. In relation to design review, 95% of the applications that are required to go to the Commission are substantially appropriate before they get there because of the great work that staff undertake with applicants before a public hearing. And in New York, 95% of the 13,000 applications received per year are resolved at the staff level. while the vision identifies strategic priorities and opportunities for a broader rethink of how we might invest time and resources, it also identifies opportunities and challenges in reflecting the diversity of the community. The data nationwide in terms of diversity within historic preservation is even more challenging. In relation to the Commemoration Commission, where the vision seeks to uplift underserved communities, it is anticipated that the Commission will not only advise on upcoming historic anniversaries, but an opportunity exists to begin telling the full range of Boston's history with the support of 3 subcommittees, each with specific goals for advising the mayor and relevant departments. An opportunity also exists to consider Boston's preservation policies and tools to ensure that they are robust and inclusive of all history, including the history of Indigenous, Black, immigrant, LGBTQ+, women, and other historically marginalized communities. Which important events, people, and places might attract a tourism interest and generate an economic development stimulus? Perhaps consideration of the vast opportunities within the education and awareness theme and how these seeds might be planted in the Boston public school system, or how historic resource surveys, which are of critical importance, not only to preservation planners, but are essential to any informed land use decisions, including how a demolition delay process might be designed to achieve best practice environmental outcomes, or how surveys, which are necessary for comprehensive planning and zoning reform. Perhaps the Commemoration Commission might reduce a challenge and advance a significant opportunity to revitalize and revolutionize our approaches to safeguard meaningful places and local events and the people who are too often left out of the official narrative of Boston's history. And in doing so, this would be achieved while being more reflective of the diversity of Boston. In relation to the archaeological program, where the vision seeks to uplift underserved communities, in preparation for the 250th anniversary, we envision a focus on the Battle of Bunker Hill and diverse histories, including Native and Black participants in battle, enslaved members of Charlestown, and women and children. We envision a focus on community archaeology, where the community might participate in an archaeological dig and the subsequent analysis. And we envision expanded opportunities for partnerships with Indigenous peoples, from the identification and protection of graves to celebrating traditional practices, intangible cultural values, and co-leading tours for university students. Up to this point, I have identified several issues and challenges, some of the opportunities and ideas, and now for some strategic priorities. A key strategic priority of the vision includes updating and streamlining historic preservation regulations, practices, and procedures that in turn would support an investment of time and resources in uplifting underserved communities and mitigating the adverse effects of climate change. To do this, we would like to review existing regulations with the landmarks and district commissions where streamlining could be supported. This might include everything from preparedness for public hearings that are reviewed for impactful applications to a sustainable commissioner roster that supports efficiency and customer service. In relation to the designation process, there are approximately 76 pending landmarks and 2 pending landmark districts where some petitions date back to 1977. Under the current system, it could take more than a decade to clear the backlog. And that is accompanied by an assumption that there would be no new petitions during that period. Clearing the backlog and developing a more sustainable approach going forward is part of streamlining. In relation to our legislative authority, the vision recognizes that we must not exercise authority over properties where no such authority exists. But as with any certified local government in the nation, we should be exercising our authority under federal and state enabling legislation to designate historic resources deemed to be significant to the city of Boston. That includes places that are of local significance. Now, I understand that there has been certain practice that has sought to regulate pending landmarks. There is no such legislative authority. And I also understand that the interpretation of the legislation that appears to have prevented the Landmarks Commission from exercising its authority to designate properties of local significance is not supported by what the legislation says. This fundamental authority has been confirmed by the City of Boston Law Department. In relation to streamlining the design review process to support efficiency and excellence in customer service, this could include everything from expediting certain reviews to inserting consistency in district standards. Incorporating and expanding best practices will serve the commissions, staff, and our customers better. Once a property is designated, we need to consider how we can be most helpful to our customers in getting them through a user-friendly process that charts a straightforward and transparent path while safeguarding the special interest of the place. This would allow for the development of a historic context statement and administering historic resource surveys that focus on underserved communities. Updated surveys are necessary so that we understand what may be of historic value and what ought to be considered for some form of protection. In the absence of updated surveys, protecting the historic character of Boston, especially in underserved communities, is an exceptional challenge and a significant opportunity. This would allow for rethinking Article 85 as a climate action strategy, supporting environmental stewardship through historic preservation pilot projects, exploring distressed homes as an affordable housing option, and exploring pilot projects that support climate action mitigation measures. In turn, we believe this would provide opportunity for broadening the historic preservation program, education and awareness opportunities, excellence in customer service, and increased interdepartmental collaboration. Amongst the strategic priorities would be rethinking Article 85, not as an extension of the same thing, but rather as a climate action strategy. The objective would be to draw strength from the environmental responsible action of recycling, including incentives for best practice environmental stewardship and significant disincentives to discourage actions that produce adverse effects on the environment. The strategy would be to incentivize the use of embodied energy that already exists in structures and embracing new development that would leave a smaller carbon footprint than the standard approach involving demolition and new construction without regard to environmental stewardship. Potential initiatives could involve repairing older and historic properties in underserved communities for greater climate resiliency, utilizing incentives to encourage energy efficiency actions in underserved communities, and identifying opportunities to increase density in older and historic communities while creating affordable housing options that mitigate the prospects for displacement. Naturally occurring affordable housing is key to providing good quality homes to seniors, working families, and first-time homeowners. Published data shows that the largest percentage of distressed single-family homes in Boston are within the communities of Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. Might a pilot project that invests in basic maintenance be beneficial not only to the environment and the comfort of occupants, but might it also be beneficial to the physical character and appearance of the community? Might it be possible for historic preservation to explore avenues that reduce displacement, not only for residents, but for congregations? Another strategic priority might draw the connection between climate change and historic preservation. There can be no doubt that climate change has and will continue to impact historic resources. Looking back, we can ask important questions about climate change. For example, how did the Massachusetts people adapt to the transformation of what we now call Boston as glacial meltwater raised the sea levels 80 meters above over the past 12,000 years? How can these adaptations or lessons learned be used to inform potential responses to current threats of sea level rise? And how might we acknowledge that sea level rise is not only one aspect of climate change that can affect historic and underserved communities? We must also have regard for those underserved communities that are subject to exceptional heat gain. Those are the communities that are often least equipped to reduce such adverse effects. Essentially, we all need to do our part in reducing the adverse effects of climate change. The City of Boston has begun a partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to complete a coastal storm risk management feasibility study, and there may be some overlap in some of the survey data that is obtained through this study that may be helpful to the Office of Historic Preservation. In relation to climate action strategies, these three known facts play an important role in this vision. Buildings are the largest consumers of energy, and the most severe harms from climate change falls disproportionately on underserved communities. In this regard, it would be beneficial to invest in those underserved communities with energy audits, weatherization, and basic maintenance. These low-tech interventions are often labor-intensive and use local materials, which in turn is good for the local economy. We need to acknowledge that historic preservation is a powerful tool for housing and economic development. Boston's local economy is inextricable from its unique and rich historic environment. In relation to the construction industry, a key indicator of strength in a local economy, the most effective low-cost measure that local governments can take to boost economic activity through this sector is by streamlining the permitting process. In this regard, it would be beneficial to expedite any application that rescues a threatened, underutilized, or distressed eligible or historic property, especially where it also satisfies the strategic priorities of uplifting underserved communities and mitigating adverse effects of climate change through historic preservation. To do this, embracing excellence in customer service, where time is money, needs to be an important consideration. Ensuring that our customers experience excellence and efficiency, ensuring that our regulations, processes, and practices are not perceived to be obstructing a reasonable outcome for historic preservation. This is a strategic priority of the vision. One of the common threads in this vision is the imperative related to keeping an eye on investment. How might such investments be made? We can acknowledge that certified local governments have a responsibility for maintaining up-to-date and accurate surveys of historic resources. We know that the U.S. Department of the Interior's Historic Preservation Fund includes surveys, but as with most partnerships, we'll likely need to come to the table with matching funds. We could partner with the National Park Service for underrepresented community grants. We have identified pilot projects that reflect capital investments. Might we invest time and resources to advocate for greater City of Boston community preservation funds? This vision leans towards an equitable and sustainable vision for historic preservation in Boston, and it keeps an eye on the 250th anniversary of the nation and subsequently the 400th anniversary of Boston. These are two major milestones that the Commemoration Commission will advise upon. And now, if you look closer into the eye, you will see strategic priorities, including opportunities for professional development for staff, capacity building, and identifying the window of opportunity that would support proactive preservation planning. In closing, we can acknowledge that the practice of historic preservation has been built and sustained primarily from the perspective and priorities that have excluded people of color, women, LGBTQ+, and other underserved communities. Equity and accessibility within the practice are vital to ensure we uplift underserved communities and create a means for people of non-dominant racial identities to participate and effectively lead preservation programs. The practice of historic preservation can no longer succeed in isolation simply by valuing heritage assets and regulating change to the physical fabric of a relatively exclusive community. In addition to the 21st century challenges of climate change, affordable housing, civil unrest, development pressures, and the need to integrate all aspects of economy, environment, society, and culture for positive outcomes, there are clear signals that we must push forward with a deliberate thoughtfulness and impactful strategies, seen through an equity lens. We know that historic preservation has historically struggled to dedicate time and resources to elevating minority voices across this nation. Boston is no exception. This vision proposes a way forward. It would seek to explore the streamlining of regulations, processes, and practices, and adding new preservation tools and practices so that time and resources can be invested in more people recognizing, interpreting, protecting, and activating a larger and more diverse history of Boston. When we think about Boston, the evidence is clear. It is unquestionably a richer place for having its African meeting house. It's Chinatown, knowing very well that Chinatowns are at risk across the nation. Might historic preservation play a concerted effort in helping owners safeguard these special places? Boston is richer for its Beacon Hill, the Hyde Park Women's Heritage Trail, Boston Common, its brownstones, And let's not forget the intangible cultural values, including ethnic foods, the cannoli at Mike's Pastry, and the oral tradition of storytelling. And speaking of storytelling, might there be an opportunity to explore how historic preservation and storytelling in Boston's Latin Quarter can support mutual cultural heritage objectives? Is there a role for us to play in sharing any distinguishing oral histories between the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag tribes? When we consider Boston's known rich history, consider the richness that may lie in all those areas that may not be commonly known. This vision would have us start by rethinking how we practice historic preservation in Boston. And by 2030, Boston's Office of Historic Preservation will be nationally known for its transformative efforts to uncover, share, and preserve local stories of the city's rich history, advancing environmental stewardship and uplifting underserved communities for the benefit of present and future generations. Thank you so much. Before we enter the Q&A session, we would like for you to take 10 minutes and write down your thoughts about 3 questions. And then we will collect them, and when you have done that, we're going to go into the latter part of the presentation, which is going to be to share some of the feedback that we have received so far.
For those of you that are joining us online, we will be wrapping up this session. Please be sure to fill out the survey. We will also have an additional several minutes for answers to questions that we've been hearing throughout the presentation. So if you're interested in asking a question directly to Murray, please hang on the line and we will get to those shortly. Thank you. Just a 1 minute warning. So finish up your comments. If you're ready to submit them, please do. 1 minute warning.
Yeah. So thank you for taking the time to provide your feedback. It is so important. This is not just about us presenting the vision, but we want to hear your thoughts. And part of what I thought would be helpful now that we have done a presentation, we also want to share with you the feedback that we've heard so far. Not all of it, because you would be here until 10 after 2. But just to give you a flavor of what some of the feedback has been. Some folks were super excited about centering the lives and stories of people who are currently absent from the dominant narrative, especially the prospect of integrating new and diverse voices into the recovery, discovery, and sharing of those stories and associated places across city neighborhoods. Also very interested in the intersection of historic preservation and climate response. A concern was that the current systems and tools that support city, state, and federal government may be at odds with or bog down the transformative change that is sought. And that respondent was also curious about what is needed to affect the systems change that is needed to support widespread community engagement in vision shaping and making. One respondent, I like the explicit focus on inclusivity and diversity in many forms. Our regulations, ordinances, and legislation are sufficient. If they were modified and strengthened, there might be fewer lengthy meetings for staff to attend. I support the expansion of our preservation efforts into underserved areas, but new initiatives call for new funding and more staff. We need to continue to preserve all Boston neighborhoods while we welcome new efforts in underserved areas and for forgotten audiences. And a concern is that the plan seems to be diverting resources we need to continue current preservation efforts to expand into new areas. We have a landmarks backlog because they need more funding. Streamlining the process is not the answer. Preserving historic buildings and neighborhoods is by nature complicated, time-consuming, and detail-oriented. Yes, more money and more areas, not streamlining, but changing the timing so that we are informed early on. I commend the plan for specifically acknowledging and centering historically oppressed and underserved communities. And a concern, there have been many efforts where communities of color have engaged with current commissions and have been told the scope of them don't address specific concerns or proposals don't meet the criteria for a number of reasons. Lack of archival evidence to substantiate claims of historic value, lack of home ownership to see as abutters, etc. I really appreciate the focus on uplifting untold stories and representing communities who have not been represented in the past. And I was also really excited to hear the discussion of the intersection between preservation and climate resilience, because I think that we don't really talk about that. And there is definitely a linkage. My question is about Article 85 and what was the thinking behind amending it. Completely rethinking Article 85 to address environmental and energy considerations, acknowledgement of the high percentage of BLC staff and commission time administering landmark review designation process to the exclusion of other proactive preservation work, visioning equity is a concern. A concern that the political will does not exist to implement the legislative or regulatory changes which may be approved by the development community or even housing advocates. And where will the financial resources come from to expand this important work? And is there political will to commit it? Protection of unprotected structures. It's a grand moment for the rebranding of preservation tools to shine. A concern, narratives are one-sided. That BPDA and the development real estate community will not support the structural and systemic changes needed to achieve streamlining. And lofty goals for a 7-year timeline in a city where change can be slow. Expanding knowledge of the city's history to all populations. Concern, funding. I love the vision, but how do we support it? How do we seize the moment? and the considerable inefficiencies of the current system and the potentially overly optimistic vision of how much and how fast it can change. Thank you for allowing me to share the feedback that we have received. Now, the floor is yours, and the Q&A begins. And anyone who is sitting in the front row may ask all of the questions. Any questions, thoughts, reflections? Yes.
I'm Martha McNamara. I'm a historic preservationist that teaches the Mission Wellesley College and I'm a resident. Thank you for your presentation. There was a lot that I heard tonight. But I'm at a loss because I don't really know how you came about developing this vision. So I wondered if you could give us a little bit of background on that. And I'm particularly interested to know who the feedback comes from. Because and maybe I missed something, but I wasn't aware of any community gatherings that talk about the vision up until now. So I just would love to know a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. The questions were how was the vision developed? And the second part of that is where did the feedback come from? So the vision was developed within the Office of Historic Preservation, having regard to our practices, reviewing legislation, reviewing our processes, talking to staff, talking to other departments where we interact, and observing other practices from other jurisdictions, other themes that are emerging nationally, and placing that into context of how we practice and what we might do. So some of the data that you saw in terms of how much time we spend on certain processes, that comes from data that is collected on a monthly or quarterly basis. So it's based on actuals. In terms of the feedback, so we had launched the vision in November when we had a gathering of members of the Commemoration Commission and the public. And so the feedback that you're seeing or did see came from that commission, the public that attended, and those that were attending online. So like your feedback is now with us, we'll be updating the presentation the next time we get it. So when folks ask, where did you get that feedback? Well, so we'll say, well, this group, plus those that are online, plus the November presentation. So we are continuing to build upon the feedback so that we have an understanding of what the community's interests are and how we might respond to that.
So will you be going out to the neighborhoods and the communities and getting feedback from people who actually live in the neighborhoods?
Yes, so the question is, will we actually be going out to the community and getting feedback from the neighborhoods? The answer is yes, we are in the process of setting up those community meetings, and the website. Yeah. The new dates for those will be updated on our website. Everyone is welcome to come. Any other questions? Yes. No, it's so the question. I think you're finished. Sorry. The question was whether we intend to insert the authority to designate properties of local significance into the current legislation. The answer is no, because it's already there. No, what I had indicated is there is already authority to designate properties that are locally significant. I acknowledge that there has been the interpretation that you cannot designate properties unless they are of state or national importance. That is not the case. Yes.
Years and was involved in the petition process. It's a very interesting experience. What I learned from it is that preservation really needs to be driven by grassroots forces. And I'm very, because that's how we preserve respect for preservation. And people feel that they have truly say in the process and that nobody can come and from above undermine it. And I share the concern of the lady who spoke first, that we are kind of a little surprised that there are divisions coming from above, and there hasn't been a process in which people could articulate their own concerns and ideas, how we can improve things. And I'm not saying that the vision that's imposed from above has to be wrong or bad, because the professionals have ability and time and education to think on these things. But at the same time, we all can see that there is a trend that across the country that politicizes many fields of our lives that don't need to be politicized. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that the great majority of people are very much support of increasing preservation efforts that would be honoring other generations and identity groups. But we need to make sure that we do not create a situation where we are diminishing the heritage of groups that are culturally perceived as somehow being wrong or dominant or oppressive. Because Boston was built by generations of people of different races, but mostly, Europeans, because they are just across the Atlantic, right? So the other, I stated that. The other concern that I had is that you mentioned that you gave an example of the New York City where 95% of the decisions is made by the staff. And I'm thinking to myself, does this mean that you want to weaken our district commissions and that commissions that draw membership from the community and represent the residents will be disenfranchised, and most decisions you want to make on the staff level, which I think would be a disaster, because no staff person knows the neighborhood and the district as well as the residents. So I know it's a lot to unwrap, but I just wanted to register those concerns.
Did you want me to acknowledge the second part as a question, or you just wanted to register it as a concern?
Please give me some comfort, because I am committed to preservation. I have spent 20 years of my life, working in my neighborhood and restoring an old Victorian home. I don't want to feel threatened that the investment that I make in my neighborhood may be sacrificed on the altar of some larger, lofty goals that may not be, that haven't been tested, may not be practical. I see a potential conflict between environmental climate policies and preservation, because older buildings will not build with climate in mind, and we may find ourselves, conflicted about preserving them because they may not be climate friendly. And yet, to preserve our heritage, we really, really need to hold on to it.
So is there a specific question that you'd like me to repeat so that those online can...
Please tell us if you are planning to diminish the control of citizen commissions on individual district commissions.
Okay, thank you for that question. The question was whether or not we are proposing to diminish the control of district commissions as part of streamlining. Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. We are sharing a vision that is being shared with the community for the community's response. We feel we have to have something on the chalkboard in order to comment on it. So when we talk about something being imposed from above, we don't see this as being imposed. We see this as information sharing. We're collecting feedback. If the feedback has a consensus that we don't want anything to change, then that will probably be the outcome. There won't be anything imposed if the community doesn't want it. So your opportunity to shape the vision is now, and at the next public meeting, and then and so on. So we wanted to bring something to you to get your feedback. In terms of whether or not we are setting out to diminish any aspect of all the great work that has been done and is continuing to be done, no, we're not seeking to diminish anything. We are looking at the opportunities and challenges that might allow us to embrace other important aspects of historic preservation beyond just the regulatory role that historic preservation typically and has historically played. So I hope that answers and gives you some comfort.
Yes, it does.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
I was here in 2000. Similar kind of thing. I also did a video where I interviewed people. You can find that. It would be very interesting to have one for 50 years. But I think I do believe because maybe we inherit a little bit of the West End, so more centralized power did not do well by the city. Now, you want to continue for a while, or recently. The other specific question I have was how long it would be.
Okay, thank you for the question. The question was, what do we mean when we refer to customers, and who are our customers? It hasn't been associated in historic preservation. In my experience, whether it is local government, state government, federal government, private practice, we often have customers. You are our customers. Builders are our customers. Applicants are our customers. So when we refer to excellence in customer service, we're talking about largely applicants who are navigating a process, and how do we help our customers go through that process. When we are talking about our internal customers, it's how do we help and work interdepartmentally with colleagues that may be working on zoning, that may be working on comprehensive planning. How do we work with our customers? So I'm using it as you could use the term client or constituent. So although some applicants might not consider themselves constituents, but customer service is kind of the term that is often used. So I apologize if that's not a term that is familiar within historic preservation, but we do have an obligation to help our applicants and constituents as a matter of excellence in customer service. Yes.
Okay, so this is a question at the end of the term. So I don't speak from a background of historic preservation, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about when you take this to the community. Are you showing them this, or do you have like a version 2 that's a little bit more accessible? Someone who might not live in this world, might not know Article 85, might not understand. So I guess my question is you're taking them, and my comment is thinking about like how can we tailor this to be more community accessible? Our officers with young people, we would love to jump in and make this accessible for young people. And as you're taking to community, like, are you thinking like this for only people who have an interest in historic preservation are showing up, or are you meeting them where they may already be?
Okay, thank you for the question. The question was, will this presentation be the same when we take it out to communities, or is there a lighter version that is more accessible? We appreciate that feedback because at the current stage, this is the presentation. As part of the need to reach out to communities whose first language is not historic preservation, we recognize that we're going to have different types of presentations following the vision presentation. It may be a reduced version of this. It may be an annotated version. It may be a publication. It may be something that we put into a newsletter. It may be participation in a monthly neighborhood association meeting. It can take a lot of different forms to suit our customers and constituents. So I hope that you've provided that feedback because it'll serve as a reminder that not everyone speaks the same language. And yes, it is important for us to reach out to all of our audiences, especially the youth. Thanks for the question. Yes.
Is that something that
So the question is elitist something that should be used throughout the presentation? Interesting question. I will have to do a word check, but I don't think that word was used. And yes, well, historic preservation is historically exclusive. That's known across the nation. It is a very exclusive profession. And if we want the data to support the language, we can look at where do we have historic properties designated and where are our historic districts? We could do that. But even if we didn't, and that's something that you will see in a number of cities, even if we didn't, the practice of historic preservation has historically been a rather exclusive practice. The data supports that. So that's just what it is. It preserves an aspect of the story, absolutely. Yes.
I'm an architectural historian that works in Cambridge and very closely in Cambridge. And there's a group of us that are currently preserving Harry Jacobs' house in Harvard Square, abolition of African American, who is now the abolition of stamps house. And we've been in concert with the developer to see how we can maintain the neighborhood and the building and tell the story, etc. We have had issues with our conservation districts that have been watered down. If that opens the doors to development, more so, making it easier for development. And the conservation districts are trying to protect the Italian, Portuguese neighborhoods and backstories. What I see here, I worry about the same approach granted in trying to get a handle on the clear theory, ideology, direction, whatever. But it always comes down to nuts and bolts legislation. How do you implement what you want to do and what you don't? And with historic preservation comes detail, and I really worry that in looking at these bigger inclusionary kinds of direction, that the nuts and bolts and the preservation of material culture itself may get lost in the shuffle. I don't want the baby to throw out the bathwater.
So can you help me in clarifying your question so that I can repeat it for those who... I can suggest what your question is, but I want you to tell me.
The question is, what has priority if there's a competition between zoning, a big money project, and the importance of neighborhoods in their history who are bearing the brunt of heat islands because all the trees are being cut down for big development. How are you going to negotiate and who has priority when you have your roundtable discussion on how to preserve particular areas?
Okay, I'll try to capture that in a nutshell. And it's really asking, how do we negotiate when there are competing interests? How about that? I think it's important for historic preservation to be relevant and play an important role, especially in a place like Boston, with any stakeholder, decision maker, owner that touches or impacts or has the potential to impact historic places. in order to be more relevant, we need to let people know that the economy of Boston is historic preservation. There are opportunities in affordable housing, which has a lot of momentum, not only here, nationally. Historic preservation can play a role in affordable housing options. Climate action is not exclusive to climate action professionals. It touches historic preservation as well. It is unlikely that any one interest is going to prevail if everyone is meaningfully at the table. But negotiating and having an opportunity to be heard in a meaningful way at the right time, as opposed to at the last minute, is perhaps our only hope of having better outcomes than not participating or not being at the table or not being relevant. So I think it's a matter of we have to be seen by all of the stakeholders as a very important part of Boston's existence. We won't win every challenge, but we should be in the important discussions, whether that has to do with zoning reform, comprehensive planning, Plan Charlestown. We should be in those discussions at a meaningful level and at the appropriate time. Does that come close to answering your question?
It does, except the term relevant in context. Is that current history?
So by relevance, I mean, if we only practice historic preservation the way we always have, there is a risk that we will not be positioned to participate in some of those other larger, important discussions because we're too busy. We don't have time to devote time and resources to affordable housing initiatives, to climate action mitigation policies, to working with our colleagues on zoning reform. We don't have time. So we're only focused on regulation. That doesn't mean that we lose sight of the detail. Absolutely not. In historic preservation, you need to be able to operate at 35,000 feet, and you need to be able to operate in the weeds. That should not change in terms of how we view change to the historic environment. So the concept of streamlining, because I know some have picked up on that, does not mean diminishing, watering, losing the detail consideration. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means it's considered in a different way that may allow more time for us to deal with some really large issues that we should be part of. Yes, question.
you know, the goal is to have everything reviewed by staff so that by the time kind of that same thing. Staff are now making a determination whether something goes to demolition site. Unless you're checking that list that is posted, granted it's posted publicly, but the decision is that say, oh, this building is torn down on I guess I'm just worried about it's such a draft and it's change. So do you reconcile how that decision reconciles with your statement that it's
Thanks for the question. And I think it was about reconciling a previous decision with an aspect in the presentation. I'm not certain of the specific decision that you're referring to. However, you may be referring to a process that is outside of our lane and is administered by another department. It is possible. Yeah, Article 85 is not administered by the Office of Historic Preservation. We are participants in that process, but that is administered by BPTA. We administer the whole. And so it is it's part of landmarks. So, but your concern is when the criteria was elevated, so that now we have a lot of properties that are not caught by that process. So then connecting back to this vision, the idea behind Article 85 is that we think about it differently as opposed to a demolition delay. Because a demolition delay does not actually achieve the purpose of historic preservation. It just kicks it down the road for 90 days or 180 days. What? Yes. Right. And the rate of success in a demolition delay process probably does not achieve the purpose that you're concerned about. And you're okay. I can come back to you on that one, Nick. Are you aware of the? I'm going to let Nick comment on that.
So what I can tell you is that the City of Boston Landmarks Commission has been staffed at a minimal level for years. And the conversation that you're discussing is a conversation that you and your community group had with myself and the executive director. We were trying to process these applications the best and the quickest way that we knew how. If there was any community feedback that these properties were significant, we took that feedback. The reality of it is we were assessing these projects based on what could be a landmark. At that time, it was our understanding that landmarks could be landmarked if they rose to the regional or national level. That's it. We have since had clarification by our legal team, and we are working to make sure that we improve this process. But the reality of it is we were a very small staff. We are continuously growing, with the addition of Murray to our team and additional staff members. That's where we were. And we are working to improve that process. We are always taking feedback from the public. Everything that we do in relation to Article 85 is available online. And if the community can reach out to us and they have a concern about a property threatened with demolition, you should talk to us. We are doing the best we can with the tools that we had at that moment. And we're continuing to do that. So.
Thanks, Nick. Yes.
Building, neighborhood planners and everything, one step down, being told that people made the decision to really. Now I'm noticing Bromfield Street. Bromfield Street has beautiful buildings, and I'm concerned with Suffolk expanding up on Tremont Street, coming down Bromfield Street. I'm going to lose that. So I don't know if you have any concerns about that or looking into that. Is there any way we can save those buildings?
Big question, and it has to do with whether or not we are concerned about the loss of buildings on Tremont, on Bromfield. We are inherently concerned about the loss of any aspect that contributes to the special character of Boston. One of the first things that we must do as a community, as a city, is we must acknowledge the importance of historic resource surveys. And until we do that, answering your question is going to be challenging. There are so many parts of the city that are beautiful and unprotected and unsurveyed. So we may not even know what is significant. And because it hasn't been surveyed, it's unlikely protected. So it's a great concern. And I've raised the concern every opportunity I get, that if we are concerned about the protection of unprotected properties, the community needs to express how important it is for having up-to-date and accurate historic resource surveys. We, as the Office of Historic Preservation, cannot do it on our own. We don't have the budget, and it has been deferred for many decades. It is a significant challenge. So I invite you to express the need for historic surveys so that we can be better prepared to protect those places that we all love. Yes?
I want to express my concern and interest in saving the buildings, interiors, we could help. And you just gave us the that. So I think that we all Beacon Hill residents feel very strongly about certain buildings on Beacon Hill and their interiors. They have significant history associated with them, and it's being uncovered as we speak. So I guess my question to you is, are you willing to preserve these interiors, or at least allow us to refer?
Thank you for the question. The question was in relation to a property on Beacon Street and whether we would allow a study report to be undertaken. We can't allow or not allow. We are not the property owner. But what I can say is, with the extensive backlog in pending landmarks that do not have study reports, we have identified this as a extremely urgent priority, that we cannot have pending landmarks from the 1970s. We also do not have the resources to eradicate or complete that list, which should have been completed many decades ago. Each year, we identify which study reports we are aiming to complete. That property was not identified last year when the current fiscal year's undertaking was set. When we have a property that has been pending for 47 plus years, we have to position ourselves to be able to respond much faster. So when I speak of customer service, one aspect of customer service relates to transparency, certainty, fairness. It is not reasonable that one might carry out due diligence and find that a property is not protected. Maybe it should have been, but we do not have the authority to regulate a pending landmark. So I hope that answers your question. Right. So in my first part of that response was, we do not own the property and we cannot enforce access. This is one of the challenges with designating interiors, whereas exteriors, we don't have to enforce access. It's visible from the public way. Yes?
Murray, we're almost at time, so maybe 2 more questions here.
Yes, we are actually over time. Thanks for all the great questions. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned to expand and I think one thing we didn't hear during your is the word investment. I heard lack of resources. Backlog. My question is, in your plan, in your vision, we didn't see any details how you will engage the community, how we can provide help to reach that goal of preservation, and how we can make the process more efficient and help. And what are the steps? I didn't see the timeline. I didn't see specific meetings. I understand this is important. What we're doing is to question the survey. Will there be clear dialogue with people that have been doing this in Boston for 20, 30 years? And for this, maybe find ways to actually improve the system and actually maximize the purpose. So it's not by necessarily streamlining, but by exporting the best processes that have been done.
So how would you like me to capture that so I can repeat it for those that are online?
So the question would be, what is your plan to engage the community and the preservation community and the community at large in the process of finding the specifics about how we can make sure that preservation is maintained, and we maintain the resources and increase the resources at the city of
question was, how do we intend to engage the community to ensure that the specifics of the vision are able to be supported by the community, and how will that, what will that look like? So part of the reason for collecting the feedback is to be able to understand which specific action items might be appropriate. If we come to you tonight with the specifics, you probably wouldn't actually appreciate the reason why that might be appropriate. So this is intended to be a relatively high level. There are some thoughts and ideas about the specifics. We will be engaging on those specifics, but it wouldn't be at this stage. It would be at a more refined stage. So we may be carving out a specific aspect of the vision. So we could probably list, 40 different action items. We may carve out one or two of those and have focus discussions or focus workshops on how we could actually move that item forward. But it's not something that we could come in a one presentation and talk about all of the details, because you'd have to bring more than your lunch. It would be a long discussion. But we do appreciate the feedback, and I hope you've conveyed that so that it serves as a reminder to us when we're going in the next stage. So thanks for the question.
So, Murray, I have a couple of questions online. I just want to make sure that we get some of these addressed.
I'm just going to read them so you don't have to do it. And the question online that we had from someone is that I would like to point out that the city itself is inconsistent about preservation. Public facilities, the fire department, and parks are among the groups that often misunderstand and misalign with the preservation goals. I've seen this in underrepresented communities, and I think OHP needs to manage this. So that would be the question online.
A comment? Okay. One of the things that the vision recognizes is important, and I know that historic preservation at the local government level typically, characteristically, doesn't invest enough in, is education and awareness. And education and awareness, we could probably use 2 or 3 staff full-time on education and awareness. When we consider our customers and constituents, our stakeholders, our users, our applicants, our builders, our architects, our colleagues in other departments, it is an enormous task that we consider is important, and that we should be positioned to invest time and resources in education and awareness. To invest time and resources, we need to think about how we operate presently. And we also need to rethink of how we become more relevant. So if we do not invest in education and awareness, not only for the folks that own property, change property, but importantly, I have always advocated for education and awareness all the way down through the school system and in the universities. Because often, now I taught at School of Architecture, we're often graduating architects that have no concept of context. They design in isolation. And we see that when we receive an application for a certificate of appropriateness. But that's too late. So the time for education and awareness is at the university level, at the high school level, at the junior high. Are we going to be teaching junior high school students about certificates of appropriateness? No. We're going to be talking about values. What do people value? People at 6, 7 years old have values. So if we don't instill values in people at an early age, they might not value what we collectively see as important. So education and awareness is so broad and so important. It takes time and resources to invest in that. Thanks for the question. Oh, yes. Yeah. Whenever I'm done. We are going to close the Q&A session, and we are going to have Mark say a few words to close us out. Mark is the chair of the District Commission. Mark.
Thank you very much, Director Miller. Thanks to Chief White Hammond. Thanks for doing this. And of course, to my friend and colleague, Nick Armada. Thank you all for your patience and forbearance and coming out here. I just want to acknowledge quickly a couple of folks. My colleague on the commission, Mo Feingold. You heard a moment ago from Martha McNamara, who is, in addition to her distinguished position in academia and Wellesley College, is also a former chair of the commission. I had the privilege of serving with Martha my first go around in the commission, which is about 10 years ago, I think. I thought I'd just use my few minutes here. I would hope to try to set your minds at ease about some of the things, some of the concerns, which I think is great to hear, and that's an important part of this process. 3 things I sort of took away from the discussion, from the questions and concerns. This question of sort of the power of local commissions. A second being sort of this notion of the focus or sort of what kinds of historic resources are included in the purview of the office and the work of historic preservation in the city. I think we could say maybe the concern about will those historic resources that have historically gotten attention, will they lose significance in the eyes of those of us doing or charged with the responsibility to do historic preservation? And thirdly, this tension, which I think it's important to acknowledge, between environmental stewardship and preservation. And those are all great questions and really important ones that I think we want to be central to this conversation going forward. But I would like to try to assure you that I think the city has already put a lot of thought into these questions. We talk about them all the time, to be honest. I think the preservation community has as well, and I'll give you some sort of concrete examples. First, with respect to the authority of local commissions. The Beacon Hill, I'll speak just for Beacon Hill. Beacon Hill is a historic district because of local activism. I had previously had the privilege of serving as chair of the board of the Beacon Hill Civic Association, one of the oldest neighborhood associations in the country. We have a historic district in Beacon Hill because of the Beacon Hill Civic Association. They led the effort in 1955 to make it a historic district and have been very, very active in historic preservation ever since. Literally every month, a representative of the Civic Association is at our hearing, providing testimony and public comment, doing their own research to help inform our decisions. We couldn't do it without them. We wouldn't be here without them. We couldn't do it without them. They're not going anywhere, I can tell you. And they'll continue to advocate for the power of local commissions, I'm sure. As a practical matter, I can also tell you that right now, as we speak, the power of the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission is in the process of being expanded, not diminished. Where there's been a bill pending in the legislature, and I want to thank Representative Livingstone, Councillor Kenzie Bach, of course the mayor, who signed the home rule petition into law. It's come out of committee just within the last 2 weeks. It'll go before the entire legislature sometime in the next 2 months. but it will expand the boundary of the historic Beacon Hill district 40 feet to Cambridge Street. And it's important to remember this is a part of a long trend. And I should say, by way of background, we're really, really lucky in Beacon Hill in that somehow, by miracle or otherwise, this astonishing collection of resources of the early African American community in Beacon Hill is remarkably well preserved. As you heard, the Middleton Glappian House is the oldest house in Beacon Hill. It's a rare wood frame building. This whole collection of wood frame buildings on Smith Court, the African Meeting House, the Evel Smith School, somehow that all survived the wave of gentrification of the North Slope. Well, it's in the district now. It wasn't originally. One of these early surveys that they did to set up the district said that the African Meeting House was only of local significance. Well, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, to the second point, what's included. We're talking about opening the aperture, not moving it off of what it's been on historically to something else. And the way we're talking about doing that is by acknowledging the importance of social history as well as architectural history. Chris Moore is here from Historic New England. I kind of cut my teeth in historic preservation thanks to Historic New England. I've been involved there for over 20 years. And from the get-go, that organization has been about social history is as important as the architectural history. And what do we mean by that in practical matters? Think of how buildings really are emblematic of civilization. The pyramids, the Taj Mahal, the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge. When you think of a place, you think of a building, right? Well, what's the most common question about the pyramids to this day, thousands of years later? Who built them, right? That's what we're talking about. The who and not just the what. And we're really fortunate that because, again, of local activism, the Historic Beacon Hill District has been expanded over time to include the North Slope, which it didn't. Now all those amazing resources are protected. So I think what we're talking about is doing what we did in Beacon Hill to make sure that this amazing collection, it's a staggering number of great old buildings in Roxbury and Dorchester, get the benefit of that same foresight that those people had so many decades ago to recognize it's not just about the buildings, it's about the people who made them and what they did there. When you open the lens further, to not just ask, is it Charles Bulfinch, right, or Asher Benjamin? By the way, the African Meeting House is actually after designed by Asher Benjamin, by the way. And just who are the people who live there? You get a much bigger set of buildings that are worthy of preservation. Now, thirdly, on the point of the tension between environment and preservation, again, this is important. I think, if anything, what I see from the city is that it is very much the attitude that preservation is good for the environment, right? We talked a little bit about it. There's a lot of carbon that's in those buildings that have already been built. And if you destroy them, you lose all that embodied carbon, and then you create a whole bunch more by building something in its place. I mentioned Historic New England. Just look at the Lyman Estate in Waltham, right? They did an energy retrofit a few years ago. It's something crazy like 67% reduction in energy consumption, and it's completely invisible. Not a single historic resource was diminished in that amazing program. I know we can do it because that's living proof of it. And I think the same is true here. Yeah, we have attention. And yeah, there's going to be folks who are going to be talking about, there was a proposal to drill geothermal wells for the Park Street School in Beacon Hill some years ago, right? There's going to be people talking about whatever it is, renewable energy and so forth. But we've been dealing with this question for years. The most common thing that comes before our commission is the replacement of windows, right? We've got a whole protocol and guidelines and so forth. Nick deals with this on a daily basis, where we've been able to accommodate new technology that saves energy without compromising historic preservation. So I'm very confident that on the whole, and as we move forward, this is going to be a good thing for preservation, and that we needn't panic about the potential collision of environmental preservation environmental stewardship with preservation. And so finally, I just would encourage you to learn more about not just this vision for historic preservation, but what we're doing here at the local level in Beacon Hill. And I will say finally, just a final note on this question of diminishing the power of local commissions. as a very practical matter, right, Nick does a huge amount of work, as do his colleagues behind the scenes to make this possible. And just as a practical matter, if we tried to dump most of what we're doing on Nick, he would just kill me. I'll just tell you that right now. So I'm not particularly worried about that. But I would encourage you to reach out to Nick, particularly if you have other questions about how does historic preservation work in Beacon Hill, what are the rules, what is the process. He's there to help you, and he's on your side. And I can say, you saw those great statistics. It's a little known fact, over 90% of the applications that come before us are approved. And as you saw in the presentation, a big part of that is because Nick works behind the scenes with applicants before they ever come before a commission to come up with proposals that are going to work for everybody concerned. And we deal with, frankly, we deal with developers, we deal with folks with a lot of resources all the time. And I'm happy to say that on balance, I think the record will show that we're able to find mutually agreeable solutions that work for everyone. And then finally, I'll just say, because there's another aspect to this that's very, very important, the adaptive reuse of buildings for affordable housing and other purposes. I want to acknowledge Allison Frazee here from the Boston Preservation Alliance. That's what they do, adaptive reuse. It's an essential tool in historic preservation. And I should say also, the Beacon Hill community has long been, a lot of people don't know this, there's the greatest economic diversity of any neighborhood in the city. We have 6 housing projects, we have elder housing, we have low-income housing, we have moderate housing. We're the only purpose-built housing facility for persons disabled with HIV and AIDS in all of Boston, right in Beacon Hill. Again, I'm confident, because we've been doing it for decades, that we can do affordable housing. We can do affordable housing in Beacon Hill, and we can do it without compromising the principles of historic preservation. So I thank you all for being here. I thank the chief, the director, and Nick, of course, for all their hard work in this. And I'm happy to chat with anyone as well. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.
So glad to be back. And sorry I missed the discussion. I was like trying to figure out if I could be, but I was also on a Zoom call, and I can confirm you cannot be on two Zoom calls at the same time. I did try for a second. But anyway, so I think really excited. I think the goal is actually to just keep the conversation going. And I think really wanted to do this in person because we think there's something different that happens when people are in the room. But I also want to do a shout out to all the folks online, because there are a significant number of folks online. And this is the second presentation. There's another coming, and many more down the line, including to other district commissions, but also to some communities where they don't have a district commission. And so we're trying to figure out how do you spark this conversation across the city. And then the real question is also, how could you create more opportunities for conversation across the city? And so really thank you for coming out. And the one thing I will say is, two things that I think are in this conversation that maybe haven't been mentioned. One is there are not enough resources out there for historic preservation. There really are not. And I think a lot of people know this as somebody who's done grant writing. The archaeology team is trying to figure. And so one of the big pieces behind this is, how do we potentially tap into other resources that are profuse in a way that allows those resources to be applied to historic preservation? And so I think it's worth noting that is one of the notable reasons that we're looking at environmental stewardship, which has a lot more resources available to it. And really, preservation is stewardship. And so the question is, how do we make sure that those resources that exist can be applied? And secondly, I just want to take a moment to note, really glad to see a intergenerational group and a recognition that there are not enough younger folks moving into this. And so the other question is, how do we look at what many younger generations are excited about and interested in, and find a way to bridge that gap to bring more people in? So now you all know that I am a pastor. I am probably in the institution that's struggling the most to stay relevant. We're losing percentage every year. And so I'm really familiar with this conversation of how do we find ways to bridge gaps between generations. And I think there's an exciting opportunity to do so. And I'm really thankful for folks who are here. I'm really trying to think that through. But I hope that you will share what you've learned, share both the things that you're excited about and the things that you're concerned about, as we really figure out how does this conversation become an opportunity to really ignite deeper dialogue across the city. And I think many of us are watching a level of change here. I remember when we couldn't get people to clean up distressed properties. We couldn't get people to even cut the grass in our abandoned lots. And now we're seeing that change happening at a maddening pace that make many of us say, oh my gosh, we need to slow this down a bit. And so I think there is no better time to be having this conversation. I think if we don't accelerate, move this conversation now, I think all of us will look up 10 years from now and be sad to see that things have changed potentially on a scale that's irrevocable. And so thank you for being in this conversation at this time. We need your voices now more than ever. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I just want to say and thank you to Murray, who's not even been here a full year. We recruited him. He has worked, you may not know, on 4 different continents, but we have him here. I'm really thankful for the way that he has brought together lots of different ideas, tried to make them into a vision that unites both the big picture and the practical in a way that gives us a path forward. So thank you for your leadership.
So that concludes our meeting for this evening. Just a reminder that you have to exit the building from Congress Street. You cannot exit through the main lobby, if anyone's listening. And thanks to everyone online that's participating. Thanks so much. Hi.